Good evening, and welcome to the second night of the 17th Annual Savannah Book Festival. If you were lucky enough to be here last night, you know that Ruth Ware did a fantastic job, and I know we're in for another great night tonight. My name is Kristen Ott, and I am the co-chair of the festival's Author Selection Committee. If you are like me, authors are your rock stars. And we are truly lucky because all of the authors presenting tomorrow are with us here tonight. This is truly a star-studded audience. And authors, if you have not been officially welcomed to Savannah, we want to say how happy we are you are with us. We cannot wait for tomorrow and the rest of the festival. Okay, today has been a busy day for SBF authors. 22 of them volunteered to meet with students and community members through our SBF at Schools program. Volunteers began picking them up from their hotel early this morning and driving them to places like Georgia Southern, Savannah State, Hardeeville Public Schools, the Marshes, and the Opportunity Center at Goodwill. And speaking of Goodwill, it is the goodwill of authors, volunteers, book clubs, sponsors, literati members, and readers like you who all come together to make this festival a reality. With an event of this scale, there are a lot of people to thank, and I want to begin by thanking everyone here for reading, for caring about books and authors, and for buying a ticket to tonight's event. Doesn't it feel good to be in a room full of readers? Tonight's ushers and ticket takers include volunteers from 3 local book clubs: the Happy Bookers, the Literary Ladies, and the Foodie Book Club. Thank you, book clubs. You guys are being very generous with applause. Thank you, that is awesome. Okay, tonight's, our festival is in its 17th year because in addition to hundreds of book lovers who volunteer their time, many generous donors support the festival financially. You can find the full list of literati members on our website and a list of our sponsors in your program. Tonight's keynote address sponsor is Maura Sovchin. You will hear the following names repeated all weekend as we continually express our thanks to the donors in the chairperson's circle: the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Cintron, Bob Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, Betsy Lancaster, the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, and the City of Savannah. Thank you everyone for your generosity. It's also worth mentioning that you can help the festival for free by following SBF on social media and by visiting our website and subscribing to our monthly newsletter. Okay, we're close to the main event. Remember that Ms. Walls will be answering questions from the audience, and readers tend to be a considerate and empathetic bunch, so I doubt you need reminding, but just in case, please silence your phone and no flash photography. And now for the good stuff, the reason we're all here. Tonight's author left behind horses, dogs, cats, chickens, and honeybees on her 320-acre farm in Virginia to be with us tonight. After graduating from Barnard College, Jeannette Walls worked as a journalist in New York City. In 2005, she rocketed to literary stardom with her memoir, The Glass Castle. It has been translated into 35 languages and sold over 7 million copies in the US alone. It stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for a truly remarkable 461 weeks, almost 9 years. It was adapted into a feature film starring Brie Larson, Naomi Watts, and Woody Harrelson, and it's worth noting that it's currently streaming on Netflix. Ms. Walls followed up her memoir's success, and this is a hard thing to do, by writing multiple best-selling novels, including The Silver Star, Half-Broke Horses, and her most recent instant bestseller, Hang the Moon. Jeannette Walls is not only an extraordinary writer, she is an extraordinary human, and we are so lucky to have her here tonight. Please join me in giving Jeannette Walls a rock star's welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Whenever I come to a new town, I love to talk to the driver. I think that's always just so indicative of what the city is going to be like. And when I took the taxi from the airport to the hotel, I asked the driver, "How you doing today?" And he said, "I'm so happy, I just can't stand it." And I thought, it's a good start. And then we drove a little bit longer, and I asked him a few questions, and he started telling me about his story of his upbringing, his past. And then I got in the jitney and went to one of the events, and the driver of the jitney started telling me about his childhood. And I thought, wow, I am in a city of storytellers. No wonder I feel at home here. So it is a great honor to be here and sharing my story with you all, which is ironic because for so much of my life, my story was a sense of shame for me. I used to write about celebrities for a living. That is not the source of shame. I know it should be, but it's not. Watch television. I was one of those boneheads with a microphone, sticking that microphone into celebrities' faces, asking them who designed their outfits. And I thought I was all that. I thought I was kind of hot. And what I would like to discuss with you all today is how I went from being a journalist to a celebrity journalist to a memoirist to a fiction writer. It was quite the journey. And I hope I've learned a lot in the process, very often from readers such as yourself. Back when I was a celebrity journalist in Manhattan, and I was going to some fabulous celebrity party all decked out in fabulous designer clothes, my taxi got stuck in traffic a couple of blocks away from the party. And I glanced out the window, and I saw a homeless woman rooting through the garbage. And I got a good look at her and realized it was my mom. And I was overcome then by shame, I will admit it. I slid in the back of the taxi. I asked the driver to take me home. I got together with my mom a couple of days later. I said, "Ma, what the heck am I supposed to tell people when they ask me about you?" And she looked at me as though I'd asked her a really stupid question. And she said, "Tell the truth." She said, "That's simple enough, just tell the truth." And I thought, I could never do that. It's too weird. Nobody would get it. And beyond that, I was completely convinced that if people knew the truth about me, that I would lose everything. I had everything I'd ever dreamed of. I lived on Park Avenue. I wore fabulous clothes. I went on television discussing important issues like who Lindsay Lohan is really dating. But something was missing. And I either, rose to the challenge or got permission to tell the truth. And I thought about this crazy life of mine that I'd spent so much time and energy trying to forget, this childhood of mine. And I thought of my very earliest memory. I was 3 years old. We were living in a little trailer somewhere in the desert. Not a big old fancy double wide, but a trailer like you attach to a car. And at age 3, I was cooking for myself. My mother is an artist, and she's never much cared for domestic chores, and so we kids were kind of left to fend for ourselves. And at age 3, I was cooking for myself, and my dress caught on fire. And I was taken to the hospital, which I will never forget because it was so fancy. They had they fed you 3 times a day and washed your face and changed the sheets even when they didn't look all that dirty. But after 6 weeks, my father rescued me. He ran in, scooped me up in his arms, ran out, jumped in the waiting car, and sped off. Dead called doing that sort of thing, doing the skedaddle. When I was growing up, we're all the time doing the skedaddle. We're all the time on the run from someone or something, and sirens behind us or whatever. Dad said it was the FBI and the CIA were out to get him. Mom said it was bill collectors, but whoever it was, we were all the time on the run, sleeping in cars, sleeping in cardboard boxes. But see, when we weren't running from something, we were chasing something. See, my dad said that all of this sleeping in cars and sleeping in cardboard boxes, that was temporary. That one of these days, he was going to build for us a great big mansion out in the desert. He called it the Glass Castle. It was going to have glass walls and glass ceiling and be solar heated. All Dad had to do was find gold. And then he was going to build us our glass castle. Well, alcoholism and a few other issues got in the way. And when I was 10 years old, we moved to southern West Virginia. Now, who moves to southern West Virginia for economic opportunity? I don't know, but that's what we did. And times got really tough. And we moved into a little shack that had no indoor heat. It had no indoor plumbing. It was wired for electricity, but we usually didn't pay the bill. So I grew up reading by kerosene light and by flashlight and candles. And times got so tough that on a couple of occasions I went into school and rooted around in the garbage after school or during lunch for something to eat. But for all that my parents didn't give me, I believe they gave me many great gifts. One was a love of learning and education. I cannot remember an age at which I wasn't reading. We always had library books in the house. Sometimes we returned them. And my dad also taught us how to do the skedaddle. So my older sister and I hatched a plan. She went first, I followed, came to New York City, got into a pretty good school, got a decent job, and I thought my life was going to be kind of normal. All of a sudden, you know, I had a flush toilet, life is good. I'm getting ready to go to school one day. I'm listening to the traffic report, and some van had broken down on the FDR Drive, and the contents had spilled all over the street. And the DJs thought it was hilarious, and were making Beverly Hillbilly jokes. But my heart kind of seized up, because that was the sort of thing that was always happening to me when I was growing up. I thought, that poor family, I hope they're going to be okay. And then later on in the day, I get a call from my mom. She said, "Jeannette, it's your mom. Your daddy and I have moved to New York City." I said, "Ma, did your van break down on the FDR Drive today?" And she said, "How did you know?" I said, "Oh, man, it was on the radio." And she took this as a really good sign, because she'd just come to New York City, and she's already kind of famous. And she figured maybe her art career would really take off here. They moved in with my older sister, and then they caught that place on fire. Then they moved into the van. They caught that on fire. The van got towed, and they ended up on the streets. My career kind of was taking off, and I was going on television discussing, like I said, important issues like Tom Cruise. And my father was an astonishingly articulate man, and he was going on television discussing the rights of homeless people and squatters. And I was terrified somebody would put two and two together and realize that he was my dad. I thought I could be the woman from nowhere, the woman without a past. But the past has a funny way of catching up with you. And it did on that day that Mom either gave me permission or challenged me to tell the truth. And so I thought, I sat down and thought about this complicated thing that we call the truth. And I thought of my very favorite memory from my entire childhood. I was 5 years old, we had no money for Christmas presents, and my dad took each of his children out into the desert night and had us look up in the sky and choose whatever star we wanted for Christmas. I've never been very subtle. I chose the brightest one, Venus. Dad had to explain to me Venus wasn't a star at all. It was just a planet. I wanted it anyway. Dad said, "What the hell, it's Christmas. You want a planet, you got a planet." And he gave me Venus, and it's my most treasured gift ever. To this day, I look up in the sky and say, "That's mine, I own that." And I love that story so much that I told it at my father's funeral. After I finished telling the story, my older sister, Lori, lots smarter than me, always saw right through my dad's BS, she folds her arms and said, "Isn't that like that sorry SOB dad of ours to go give away something that doesn't belong to him in the first place?" And I thought about that comment a whole lot while I was sitting down trying to tell the truth. Because Lori's absolutely right. Dad's giving me Venus was a meaningless gesture. But I'm right too. It was a priceless treasure. It is whatever you choose to make of it. And that is one of the magic of storytelling, it's how we tell our stories. We are all storytellers. Anybody who's ever answered the question, "How was your day?" You're a storyteller. You pick and choose which stories you will tell. Will you concentrate on the jerk who cut you off in traffic, or the grocery clerk who was so lovely to you? How do you tell your stories? We shape our stories. But then our stories shape us, because we start playing a role in those stories. I hope that in sitting down and confronting this past that I'd spent so much time and energy trying to forget, I hope that I learned some of the lessons I should have learned a long time ago. When I was about 5 years old, I thought I heard a monster under my bed. Actually, this was at age 4. And I thought I heard a monster, and I went in and told my dad, I said, "I think there's a monster under my bed." And halfway expecting to say, "Honey, there's no such thing as monsters. Now go back to sleep." Instead, he says, "Was it a wicked-looking creature with these great big old long sharp teeth?" I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Well, that sounds like old monster." He said, "Old demon." He said, "Old demons, he's been chasing me for years, but now I guess he realizes Rex Walls don't scare so easy, so he's going after my kids. Let's go get him." So he gets out a great big old hunting knife and gives me a pipe wrench. And we go look for old demon, look under the bed, couldn't find him, go out in the desert night, and Dad's cussing up a blue streak. I'm getting the swing of things, and I'm waving around my pipe wrench. "Come here, demon, I'm not scared of you." No demon. Dad sits me down and says, "You know, honey, that's just like old demon. He's a bully, but he's also a coward. thing you got to do with old demon is you look him in the eye and you let him know you're not afraid, and he turns tail and runs. Well, what Dad was trying to tell me was to face my fears. And I've always thought of myself as a kind of brave person, the way I was raised. I'm not afraid of snakes or the dark or anything like that. When I moved to New York City, I got mugged a couple of times, but that was nothing new. I got beat up wherever I lived, so I just kind of fought back. But it took me a long time to understand that I was afraid for so long of my own demon, of this creation of mine. And I've come to realize how wise my crazy drunken daddy could be, that you run from these things, these fears, these demons that we all create. They will pursue you. But if you're as lucky as I've been, you can confront your demon, and if you're truly lucky, you put a harness on your demon and you put him to work for you. Because I've come to believe that so often these things that we dislike about ourselves, that we think make us less than the other people, are the best thing we have going for us. And this is a conclusion I'd come to well before I came out of the closet about my past. I used to work at a kind of snooty magazine in New York where people were members of, the blue blood and in the society register and all that. And I befriended a very well-to-do woman. We're not talking just kind of money. We had houses in Switzerland and stuff. And she wanted to go on vacation. So I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. We'll go on vacation with a rich person. I asked her what she had in mind. And she wanted to go on something called Outward Bound. Now, I'd never heard of this here Outward Bound thing before. And she explains to me that you pay a rather substantial amount of money and you go out into the wilderness and you forage for food. I didn't want to say anything, but I'm thinking, honey, the first 17 years of my life were in Outward Bound, So I called my brother and said, Brian, you are not going to believe this. Rich people got to pay for their hardships. And we thought that was just about the funniest thing we'd ever heard. Until I got to know this woman better. And she's so strong. This woman is made out of steel, but she doesn't know that. Because her extremely well-to-do parents took away the obstacles in her life. They also took away the gift we get from learning to navigate obstacles. And I'm not knocking wealth. If you got money, God bless you. I got a little myself right now. I love it. But everything in life is both a blessing and a curse. And I think, that one of the blessings of my childhood is I'm a fighter and a scrapper. And one of the curses of my childhood is that I'm a fighter and a scrapper. And it took me a long time to understand you don't always have to fight. You don't always, but if you have that ability, it's good. But it wasn't until I was able to take off the armor and accept the goodness and the kindness of the people around me. I used to think that the way to feel good about yourself was to feel superior to other people. And as such, I'd lived in New York City for a while. And I decided to go back to this little town in southern West Virginia where I grew up and show them what a sophisticated, elegant New Yorker I'd become, as y'all can tell from my sophisticated accent. And I decided to have lunch in this restaurant that always seemed kind of la-di-da too expensive for me. It was a coffee shop, but everything is relative. So I put on my fanciest clothes and I sashay into the coffee shop thinking I'm all hot, take a seat at a prominent booth. And the waitress comes over and hands me a menu. She looked maybe 30-ish, and she might have had a kind of tough life, but I wasn't focused on her. I was focused on what she thought of me. So she hands me the menu, and it says, special today, fish. Now, I knew from having eaten at fancy restaurants in New York, how the waiter comes over and he says, the special today is a lovely Chilean sea bass covered with caramelized crust, whatever. And so the waitress comes over and she says, can I help you? I said, yes, what is the fish? Now, I was being a jerk, because I knew darn good and well what the fish was. It wasn't some lovely Chilean sea bass. It was a little square piece of fish with breadcrumbs. It was fish sticks, which happens to be my favorite fish anyway. But I was trying to humiliate the waitress into saying, oh, well, this is not a fancy restaurant like you're obviously used to eating at. This is just a little coffee shop. So I said, what is the fish? And she said, excuse me? And I said, the menu says special today. Fish. What is the fish? And she looks at me to see if she'd heard what I just asked her. And then she kind of looks around to see if anybody else had heard what I just asked her. And then she says, kind of slow and careful so I can understand her, the fish is an animal what swims in the water. So I'm trying to impress her with how sophisticated I am, and she's thinking, make them pretty dumb where you come from, huh? So I failed miserably. But if I would have succeeded, the only thing I would have succeeded in doing is making her feel bad about herself. And I wouldn't have felt any better about myself. It's only through storytelling. You know, if I'd wanted to feel better about myself, I should have introduced myself. And maybe I would have heard a story like I heard from the drivers in Savannah today, and I might have made a friend, but I didn't know that. I was so scared and so determined to protect myself. I thought when my book came out, like I said, I was afraid I'd get fired and ostracized. There was one particularly rich person at the place where I worked, trust fund baby, and so the book comes out, and we're at a book party. It wasn't a book party for me, but I see her across the room, and she comes running at me. A true story, I clench my fist, because she might be rich, but I'm tough. I can take her down. And she picks up her arms. I'm ready to fight her, and she throws her arms around me. And she said, I've been in a book club for 12 years, and it wasn't until we read your story that it got real, and we all started talking about our childhoods. And you have inspired me to write my memoir. And that, my friends, is the power of storytelling. But I didn't know that. I was, like I said, I was prepared to be met with contempt and ridicule. Any author who tells you they don't have a fantasy for their book is lying, because it's an excruciating process, and I never dreamed of the bestseller list. I never dreamed of a movie being made about it. I hope that one day a rich kid would read it, and that rich kid would be a little bit nicer to those of us from the wrong side of the tracks. And then as I worked on it a little bit longer, I developed a bolder and more ambitious hope, and that was that somebody who grew up like I did would read it, and would get hope the same way that I got from reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn when I was 10 years old. I've been very blessed in that my story has been read in many schools, and people are just so much smarter about it than I ever expect them to be. But you are doing such a great job, and I'm so sorry. So not long after the publication, I was approached by a young woman. She said, I read your story while my family was vacationing in the Caribbean. And I said, oh, there's my rich kid, right? And she said, there's a girl in my class, and she always wears these ugly, out-of-date clothes. And me and all the other cheerleaders make fun of her. And now I understand, and I will never make fun of her again. I thought, the Lord can strike me down with lightning right now, because I've done my job on this planet. But not long after that, I was approached by a young man who said, I hate books and I hate reading, but I enjoyed your story. And I said, well, if you hate books, why did you enjoy this one? And this young man, he ponders that question for a moment. And he said, that there's a fine white trash story. And the woman behind him said, I believe that was meant as a compliment. But I took it as a compliment because, my friends, you know, I think we memoirs get a little bit of a bum rap. People think we're exhibitionists. And they'll feel sorry for me, all these awful things happened to me. And that's not it at all. We're sharing our experience. This is what I learned from what I went through, and maybe you can learn something from it. And in my experience, people have been so wise and so kind. A teacher told me she had her students read it, and she said there was one young woman in particular, she wanted to read it. She said, she's a good girl, but she's had a few brushes with the law and seen the inside of a jail cell. And I was hoping your story would kind of open her eyes about crime and punishment, all those good topics. And this young woman, she comes to class and slams the book down on the desk and said, that's a very upsetting book to me. And the teacher said, why is that? And she said, there's a scene where the mother takes 3 of the children to go shoplifting for one of the kids, and that is just wrong. The teacher thinks, oh, this is great. I've having a conversation with this woman about crime. She said, what in particular bothered you about that scene? And this young woman says, when you go shoplifting for one of the kids, you've got to get something for all of them. And the teacher said, we had quite the eye-opening conversation. She said, I'd always thought of this young woman as a rule breaker. And after that conversation, I realized she's not a rule breaker at all. She was just taught a different set of rules. And y'all get that. And that comment really stuck with me, and I'll come back to it, because as important as I feel that it is to tell your story, if there's one thing that is more important than telling your story, it is listening to other people's stories. And I think you cannot truly hear another person's story until you come to terms with your own. So I write The Glass Castle. I thought I'd go back to my fabulous job sticking my microphone into celebrities' faces. And a funny thing happened. Like I said, I thought I'd get fired, didn't get fired, go back on the red carpet, and a couple of times, rather famous people would ask me, would you please turn off your microphone? I need to talk to you off the record. And they would say something along the lines of, thank you for writing about alcoholism in such a compassionate way. My father reminds me a lot of your father. And I've bought several copies of your book to give to friends who cannot understand how I could love somebody who's been so horrible. And I think, dang it, I can't write anything mean about that person now. So I didn't get fired, but I got defamed. And I believe in truth-telling, but what is accurate is not necessarily what's true. And you can tell the truth about somebody, but it is that deeper truth, you know, John Steinbeck, one time he wrote a satire. It was just in manuscript form. He gave it to his agent, and he called her later and said, you must throw that manuscript away. He said, I've dedicated my entire life to try to get people to understand other people by telling the truth. But that satire looks to incite embarrassment and ridicule through half-truths. And that's what characters and stereotypes are. They might be accurate, but they're not the deeper truth. So I had to quit the day job. I didn't know what to do. My husband suggested we move from New York City, where I lived for more than 30 years, to rural Virginia. My mother was living on the streets at the time. We took her with us, and not with me because I'm not a saint. We put her out back. So I was touring on behalf of the Glass Castle, and people kept asking me about Mom. They said, I understand your father, I understand alcoholism, your mother had college degrees, she had the resources to live a somewhat normal life, why did she not do that? And so I got asked so many times that I thought, well, maybe there's another book here. I'm not a serial memoirist. You know, some people write a bunch of memoirs about themselves. I'm not that interesting. There's only one book, and it wasn't even about me. It was about my mom and dad. But so many people asked about Mom. I thought, well, maybe there's a book there. So I didn't invite Mom to live with us for the purpose of exploiting her, but as long as she's there, what the heck? So I said, Ma, how would you feel about my writing a book about you? And it was she who said, no, it should not be about her, but rather about my grandmother, her mother, Lily Casey Smith, who was a foul-mouthed, gun-toting, horse-breaking school teacher. And she wasn't just the school teacher, she drove the school bus, which wasn't a school bus, it was a hearse with the word school bus painted on the side. And it was all the time getting stuck in the mud. And she'd make the students get out and push, and while they were pushing, she'd make them recite the Hail Marys. And she'd say, push and pray, kids, push and pray. And it's become a little bit of a philosophy of life for me, push and pray. So, you know, this woman who I wanted nothing to do with, she comes down and lives with me and gives me a new book and a philosophy of life. And it was such a valuable lesson in, you know, in confronting your story, not just confronting it, but embracing it. I wrote another book that's somewhat based on family members, Silver Star. I thought I've got nothing left to write about. I've milked that cow dry. And, you know, I can't really write about my family more. And I was touring on behalf of the Glass Castle, and people kept saying to me, you should write fiction, you should write fiction. And I'm like, no, I'm a truth teller. I'm a fact finder, I'm a journalist, whatever. I was on a panel one time with the wonderful Lisa DeGenoa, who wrote Still Alice and many other great books. And somebody asked her, what is the best fiction writing advice anybody's ever given you? And her answer was, take an acting class. Oh, she doesn't know what the heck she's talking about. But it kind of stuck with me because she's a smart woman. But like I said, I've always just loved fact. You can't make this stuff up. The truth is stranger than fiction. I love storytelling. I love journalism. I love hearing stories from bus drivers or people I'm signing the book for, whoever. People tell me stories about themselves, and it's so fascinating. They start crying, and they'll say, I'm so ashamed. I've never told anybody this before. And I think, why would you be ashamed? I'm hearing this amazing story of survival and power. And I'm going, oh, yeah, I was ashamed, too. But that's the power of storytelling. A wise man once told me, he said, secrets are a little bit like vampires. They suck the life out of you, but they can exist only in the darkness. Once they're exposed to the light, there's a moment of fear, but then poof, they lose their power over you. And I found that to be so true. So that's, you know, I'm just this big fan of truth-telling and fact-finding. And I tell readers that, and they say, you should write fiction. No, I can't write fiction. And I was at an event one time, and this gentleman, after my saying that I don't make things up, I have no imagination, I can't make things up, this gentleman raises his hand and rather shyly says, ma'am, forgive me, I think you have a fabulous imagination, but you're afraid of creativity. I was like, oh, oh, that's a heavy thought, isn't it? And I think this guy was onto something because I come from a wildly creative family. Both my parents were writers, and there were characters in their heads at all time, and stories would come out sometimes at their behest, sometimes against their behest. And I think I associated making things up with lying and insanity, both of which run in my family. And I was kind of scared of it, but after this gentleman said that, I thought maybe I need to rethink things. Like I said, you know, readers are smarter than I am. That's why I love talking to them. But I didn't really know where to start with all that. The Glass Castle was optioned as a movie even before it was published, but it was in turnaround for forever. And around 2015, there was some serious movement in it. A wonderful director and producer got a hold of it. And there was some searching around who to cast as my father. And they finally settled on Woody Harrelson, which I thought was a kind of peculiar choice. Everybody loves Woody Harrelson, but he looks nothing like Dad, and when he had hair, it was blonde, and my dad was dark hair, but I figured that didn't really matter all that much. And even before we met, Woody, he called me a couple of times, and he started asking questions about Dad. He wanted to know, when he talked to you, did he look you in the eye? And when he talked to you, what did he do with his hands? And I said, well, he crushed beer cans. Not wimpy beer cans like we got now, but back when beer cans were beer cans. And he said, like Cool Hand Luke. And I said, Dad was Cool Hand Luke. For those of you who don't know, it was a 1960s movie with Paul Newman. And I said, Dad was Cool Hand Luke. He goes, that's my favorite movie. And I think he really liked that because I came to realize these actors like to hang their performances on something. They don't like to make something out of whole cloth, but he kept asking questions about Dad's walk. I think he felt that if he could get Dad's walk, then he could get Dad's personality. And so I was trying to describe Dad. He said, can you describe your dad's walk? And I said, well, he had a kind of long-legged, lean-hipped walk. And Woody said, I don't know what that means. I said, that's good, it doesn't mean nothing. So I'm clomping around my office trying to do Dad's walk, and I couldn't do it, but he could hear me clomping. He said, I wish I could see it. I'm like, no, you don't, I look like RuPaul. I couldn't do Dad's walk. And I figured, like, well, he'll get it eventually, but he kept asking these really interesting but very direct questions. So the first day that I showed up on the set of The Glass Castle, it's interesting to me that some of you probably don't know this, but they filmed the most complicated scenes of the day early on in the day where the actors are still fresh. And the scene that they were filming that morning was when my character, Brie Larson, was leaving home, and Woody Harrelson, my father, was trying to convince her to stay. And the first time I saw Woody Harrelson in character, I burst into tears. I could not believe it. He had the facial muscles, he had the cigarette behind his ear, he had the posture, he had everything. And I couldn't believe it. And they went through the scene, and then here's the point of the story. Then they went off script, and Woody started saying things that my father had said that I hadn't told him. And I was a mess. I was crying. We're not talking pretty tears. I was slinging snot, and it was bad. It was bad. And when Woody left, he saw me. He saw me over in the corner like, ooh. And I knew, I'm not an idiot. I knew he wasn't my father, but like an idiot, I start apologizing. I'm sorry. I felt I had to leave, and he comes over, and he hugs me, and in my father's voice, he said, you had to do it, honey. You had to do it, or we wouldn't be here. And it was one of those miracles that life will hand you every now and then, that, 30, 40 years after my dad dies, I hear an apology in my father's voice, and I thought, that's what this making up business is about. It's not necessarily about creating things out of whole cloth, making things up. It's about stealing shamelessly and being inspired by people that you know and situations that you see. And it gave me the courage to try to write fiction, to try to make up characters. And I still haven't taken an acting class, but the degree to which I can do this magic that these actors were doing. And the key word here is empathy. It is empathy. It is understanding what goes on with other people and putting yourself in their shoes and feeling what they feel to the degree that you can create dialogue for them, that you know what they would say in a given situation. I'd long been haunted by a story of, I wanted to tell the story of a woman who wanted to get into the family business, who hugely admired her overbearing father, but because she was a woman and it was a man's business, a man's world, she wasn't allowed to get into it. I've also long been fascinated by Prohibition, the period. Back when I was around 8 years old, I was the sort of kid, like many people in this room probably, who would read anything with words on it. On one morning when I was 8 years old, that something happened to be a whiskey bottle, which had been repurposed as a vase. And I turned it around and it said, federal law forbids resale or reuse of this bottle. And I said, Mom, we got to throw out the flowers. And she said, what are you talking about? I said, it's illegal. You're not supposed to reuse this bottle. And she looks like, oh, that was Prohibition. That's a stupid law. You can ignore that. I'm like, Mom, how can you decide what is a good law and what is a bad law? And she told me about Prohibition. She told me about this wondrous period in 1920 to 33 when it was illegal to drink. And I wanted to live during this wondrous time that I thought all our problems would be solved. Dad would be sober. And she said, oh, no. It was a disaster. Crime went through the roof and drinking actually increased. And I thought she doesn't know what she's talking about, but of course she did. So my first real venture into pure fiction, it's set during Prohibition, a woman who wants to get into the family business. And I'm not going to claim that I was able to do what Woody Harrelson did, but I hope that I was able to bring characters to life. I think that in writing and fiction, the plot is easy. It's the characters. If you can create realistic and believable characters, that is what sucks in people. When you think of great literature throughout history, you think of Lady Macbeth or Scrooge, you think of the characters, these people who feel real. And I hope that those of you who choose to read Hang the Moon care about Sally. I know that I did. In fact, when I did the audio, I was a little bit nervous that, there's so many characters in there, but I cared about each of these characters so deeply that I knew how they all spoke. I'm not saying I'm on Woody Harrelson's level, but that empathy that I hope that I learned from the actors, I brought to my writing. And I'd like to share with you one of the thoughts of Sally. I know that I thought that I would fall in love with the 1920s, because jazz era, and everybody's reading Gatsby and, doing the Charleston. And the opposite happened. It was a very dark period. I think the cure for nostalgia is research. But there's one particularly dark time that Sally is sitting out at nighttime, and she's looking up at the stars. And she's thinking, the stars are out during the day, but we don't see them. And it's only in the darkness. You need the darkness of night to see stars by their own light. And so that's something I hope that you remember in times of darkness, that there are gifts in the darkness, and you just have to sometimes look for them and not forget them. And this past of mine that I thought was just so filled with nothing but ugliness and horror has been such a gift for me. And this woman, my mother, who I wanted nothing to do with, bringing her back into my life was such a gift for me. Not a gift without some problems, but she was a complicated lady. When she came to live with us, we put her on a horse. She grew up on horseback, and she was a very talented rider. But one day, she was in such a good mood, and Mom was always in a good mood. My mother passed a couple of years ago. It was a good death. It was beautiful, but on this particular day, Mom was She was just glowing. I said, Mom, what are you in such a happy mood about today? She said, Jeannette, the most wonderful thing happened. I said, what's that? She said, today I fell off a horse. And I said, Ma, I know you can put a positive spin on anything, but how could even you think that falling off a horse is a good thing? And she said, well, Jeannette, it's kind of obvious. She said, any dang fool can ride, but knowing how to fall, that takes great talent. And I was thinking about that during Ruth Ware's wonderful presentation yesterday. She was talking about falling. And, we all fall. There is no shame in falling. And the lucky among us know that we know how to fall because we've fallen so many times. And it is that falling that, first of all, it's what makes for the good stories. That's what most stories are about. They're about survival. But you get up and you move on. And you learn something from your falls, too. If you just fall and it's just something bad that happens to you, then you don't learn anything. But we all fall. There is no shame in falling. The only shame comes if you think that you don't have what it takes to get up and move on. And if you get a little dinged up in your fall, that's okay, too. And that's something that it took me a while to understand. At one point in my life, I was dating a kind of well-to-do gentleman who, his dad was a diplomat. And this is somebody who went to Outward Bound, for gosh sake. So I thought, once he finds out about me, he's going to drop me like a hot potato. But things started getting kind of serious, so I said, I got to kind of come clean with you about myself. I had a kind of weird childhood. And they said, well, weird how? And I said, well, when I was 3 years old, my dress caught on fire, and I had to go to the hospital and get skin grafts and stuff like that. And he said, what are you trying to tell me? I'm like, well, I'm kind of dinged up. I'm kind of damaged goods, And he said, you're apologizing for your scars? He said, don't ever apologize if you have scars. He said, those scars are a sign that you survived and that you were stronger than whatever you were up against. I said, I wish I was nice and smooth like other people. And he said, oh, no. Smooth is boring. You've got texture. He said, you've got texture. Texture's interesting. So I married him. I married him, and he pulled a story out of me. He told me at one point, he said, Jeannette, when you first told me your story, I thought you were exaggerating, and then I met your mom. Woo. But, he pulled it out of me, and he was the one, the first version I wrote, I just kind of glossed over everything, and he read an early version. He said, if your parents weren't feeding you, how did you survive? I said, I'm kind of tough, I'm kind of resourceful. He said, no, I don't know. And he was the one who made me, I was never a liar, but he was the one who really made me tell the truth. And it's funny because now this past that used to haunt me, it doesn't haunt me anymore. And I love that story about the texture. I think it is I thought it was perhaps the wisest and kindest thing that anybody ever said to me. Until one time, I was giving a talk in southern Florida, a very well-to-do area, and everybody was all blinged out and everything. And I told that story about wanting to be nice and smooth like other people. And this woman comes up to me and she says, sweetie, let me explain something to you. She said, there is no such thing as smooth. She said, you look close enough, silk's got texture. And so I think that is perhaps the wisest and kindest thing anybody's ever said to me. And I share it with you all. We all have our texture. We're all a little dinged up in one way or another. And some of us are lucky enough to have the silky texture. And some of us are lucky enough to have texture that's a little bit rougher. And, my closing thought to you all this evening is that if you are lucky enough to have the silky texture, don't think that that somehow makes you less strong. And if you are lucky enough to have texture that's a little bit rougher, don't think that that somehow makes you less valuable. It is your texture. They are your scars. They come from your stories. And they are however you choose to tell them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Nobody skedaddle just yet. That was fantastic. It's time for question and answer. We can bring up the lights. This is how it's going to work. We have our book club volunteers throughout the audience with microphones. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. As readers, we understand relating to stories and wanting to share thoughts and personal experiences. However, in the spirit of empathy for your fellow readers who are here to hear from Ms. Walls, please save your personal stories and comments for later conversations and use this time to ask actual questions. One question per person, please, and it's all of you go.
Yeah, ask anything. Ask anything. I'm pretty much impossible to embarrass. One time somebody said, why did your family leave Arizona? You had some stability and some security. Why did you leave? I said, I don't know, man. I've tried to ask my mom, and she can't get a straight answer from her. My husband's tried to ask her, so I can't answer your question. This woman in the audience raises her hand. She said, I know. I said, how do you know? She said, my book club discussed it. So ask whatever you want, and if I don't know the answer, we'll ask a book club person.
Jeannette, we live in a litigious society, and I checked you out. As far as I can tell, you never got sued as a gossip columnist, and you never got sued as a novelist. How did you avoid that?
I did get sued one time. It was for something my assistant wrote. It's funny, and it wasn't even the story, it was the backstory, and part of the agreement, part of the settlement is that I can't discuss it. I wish I could, it was a fascinating case, but as a memoirist, it's interesting because the law is very much in favor of the storyteller. The law, allows us to tell our story as long as we don't attribute a crime to another person. So it's most people who are grappling with whether or not they can tell the story without getting in trouble are less worried about the law and just the effect on friends and family. In my experience, the friends and family are kind of with the law. It's in favor. People are actually rather generous in my experience, and in the other memoirs I know as well. Telling your story, as long as you do it in compassion, not with a sense of revenge, but just to sort of, this is what happened to me. And a fellow memoirist told me, just describe everybody as really good looking and they won't sue you. But I think just try to tell the truth and very often present your manuscript to your friends or your family and say, what do you think? And you'd be surprised if they come back and say, well, what you don't know is this. So I think that storytelling is very powerful, and both the law and public sentiment tends to be on your side. Other questions?
Hi.
I don't know where you are.
I'm up here.
Okay.
I know that your mom was very sentimental about a lot of things, that she refused to sell that ring when y'all were hungry, and she didn't want to sell the land when you needed the land.
Yeah.
I was just curious about her art. Did she ever sell any of her art? I know she said that, people aren't famous until after they die. I was just wondering, was she willing to sell her art? Did she ever sell any of it?
We'll be having a sale afterwards. No, it's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. First of all, I didn't understand this about my mother when we were traveling around so much. My mother was a hoarder, which I didn't, because our houses were always burning down or always leaving them. But once she got settled, she was just filling up the house with everything. And the thing about hoarders, many artists are hoarders because they see the beauty in everything and the value in everything. But Mom did not. I got her an art show in Orange, Virginia, where we live. And also the producer of the movie, of The Glass Castle, tried to buy one of her paintings, and she wouldn't sell it to him. She said, you can't afford it. So she didn't want to let go of them. And I've got a barn full of about, I think, at least 1,000 paintings. And I kind of don't know what to do, and I give them to people I love. No, she was not that interested in selling her paintings or the land or the ring. And I've I got the ring when Mom died, and I gave it to my niece who's getting married, and she's going to use it as her wedding ring. So, you know, no regrets. No, you know, somebody said, "Why didn't your mom sell that land? Y'all could have." We had land in Texas, and why didn't your mom sell that land? Y'all could have had a normal life. And again, a reader rose to the occasion and said, "If she'd have sold that land, that no-good husband would have got his mitts on the money. It would be gone in a 3-day bender." And it's true. So no regrets. You know, people have said, "Why aren't you angry about the childhood? Why aren't you mad about all these?" You know, how could you forgive your parents? And to me, it's less a matter of forgiveness than acceptance. How do you forgive somebody for being damaged? You know, Mom, she has many lovely qualities, but she was loopy. But she also gave me many gifts. And if I hadn't had that life that I had, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be standing up here. They put me in a fabulous hotel. I went to a fabulous dinner, and I'm talking to you all. I spoke to some students earlier today, and they came over and shared their stories with me. And God, life is so beautiful. If you are where you want to be, why regret how you got there?
Hi, I'm over here.
Oh,
I have a question about writing. So, can you talk a little bit about how the writing as a magazine journalist and as a celebrity journalist informed your writing as a memoirist and then as a novelist?
thank you so much for that question. First of all, I've never had writer's block. You can probably tell up here, like I just go on. I just say whatever comes to my mind. And part of that I attribute to being a journalist. That like you're on deadline, and anybody grappling with writing, my advice for whatever it's worth, don't worry about what it sounds like on the first verse. Just get it out. You can always edit it. Good writing is rewriting. That being said, the first version of The Glass Castle was very bad. And that's not false modesty. My bad writing default mode is a very stilted journalistic type of, I'd heretofore not considered the plethora of influences. And my agent read it and she said, "Jeannette, you wrote this as though it happened to somebody else. You have to describe what it really felt like and how it affected you." It didn't affect me at all. I'm perfectly normal. Nothing bothers me, And she said, you've got to get close. You've got to peel it off. But I found that every time I tried to write it from an adult voice, I would pass judgment on my parents. I'd start talking about what their influences were. And this is the hardest part of, especially writing a memoir, but of any kind of writing, creative writing, is finding your voice. And that took me a while. So I wrote the first version in 6 weeks and spent 5 years rewriting it. And that was trying to be honest. And by that, I don't mean not lying. I meant explaining what really happened and how I felt about it. And the big breakthrough for me was writing it as a child, from the child's perspective. And this little kid who just adored her daddy and just believed in all of his BS lies and, and the general sort of growing up and realization that he wasn't going to build a glass castle. And Frank McCourt had a similar, Frank McCourt, who wrote, of course, Angela's Ashes, which won a Pulitzer. He was trying to write like T.S. Eliot and all these poets he admired, and it just wasn't working for him. And then he was talking to his grandchild, and he said it was that simple child's voice that really spoke to his heart. So finding your voice is the biggest challenge in writing this sort of thing. And I had to kind of leave the journalistic thing behind. But journalism served me very well in that I don't have writer's block. I just, people say, well, what kind of atmosphere do you need to write in? I could write in a subway. I can write anywhere. That doesn't bother me. I write badly and quickly. And then I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And usually when I'm writing badly, it's because I'm not getting deep enough. I'm being glib, I'm being shallow, I'm being, one-liners. And anybody looking to write your memoir, take those stories that you tell at the cocktail party and get honest. Get deep. How did it really affect you? What really happened? And confront those demons and confront, and be unafraid. Just exploit the bejesus out of this childhood. And if there's something that's so weird and so horrible, you cannot imagine putting it down on paper, that means you must, paper or computer or whatever. And you can always take it out. You can always fictionalize it. But I'm such a big fan of telling your story, even if you choose not to share it. The first time I read my own story back, I was like, dang. I was a little shocked. It was a little darker than I thought it was. And, you know, I definitely did push things into the corner, but shine your light in those dark corners, and that's where you'll find the jewels. And those things that I was so afraid to talk about, those are the things where people come up and tell me, thank you for discussing that. You took me out of the isolation of my shame and made me realize that it didn't just happen to me. And this, again, this is why we tell our stories. Whether it's journalism, fiction, nonfiction, I don't care. You know, there are theories that storytelling began around the campfire, and people would discuss how they killed the wildebeest, or where they found the berries, or whatever. And this is how I survived. And that's what all storytelling is. Whether it's science fiction or historical, this is how we endured. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, even romances, it's a form of survival. And we share what we know. We bring ourselves to the story. People have asked me in the Glass Castle, oh, well, you must have made some of it up, right? Memoirs make things up. No. Once you start making things up, then it becomes fiction. People told me, you could have called Half-Broke Horses nonfiction because it was mostly true. Mostly true doesn't count. Once you start making stuff up, it's fiction. But I think that they both serve the same purpose. And this is something that I thought was blasphemy 20 years ago, but I think that fiction and nonfiction are a lot closer than I used to realize. I think that good fiction borrows the tools of nonfiction and vice versa. That, you know, that each you can learn from the other. And when I was writing The Glass Castle, my husband, who's, you know, he's a very accomplished writer, and he said, don't be afraid to use the tools of fiction. Oh, what the heck are you talking about? But you can cut a story off at the end. You don't have to tell the whole thing. The characters in your life become characters in a book, and it is a story. And we share these stories. This is how I survived. And in sharing those stories, you know, it takes us out of our isolation, but it also takes the readers out of their isolation. And people have asked me, you know, it must be so weird having all these people know all this stuff about you. It is the opposite of weird. It has changed the world for me from a place filled with potential enemies to a place filled with potential friends. I can walk up to a complete stranger who's read my book and say, girlfriend, you think you had a weird childhood? What did you hear about mine? And you cut right through the small talk, and you start talking about these things. And people from different parts of the world or whatever would end up hugging each other. And that is not only, you know, what this talk is about, that is what this whole festival is about. It's about sharing these stories, taking down the barriers of fear and isolation and them-ism, and saying, wow, you know, we all have different stories, but they overlap and we all share so much. Thank you. Thank you.
It's amazing.
Thank you.
True. No, that was incredible. So, Savannah is home to Flannery O'Connor's childhood home. This is her book, The Cartoons. Please take this as an expression of our appreciation, a memento of your time here in Savannah. Jeannette will be signing festival purchase books at a table in front of the stage in just a moment. If you received a numbered signing card with your book purchase, line up according to your number. We hope to see you tomorrow for a full day of free author presentations. Please be kind to the volunteers and thank them. And if you, by any chance, can't get into a presentation tomorrow that is free and open to the public, please have Jeanette's mother's attitude about falling off a horse. We will be back here on Sunday at 2 p.m. for David Gran. And lastly, as the co-chair of the Author Selection Committee, I want you to know you can submit nominations for authors for next year's festival through our website from March through May. So until tomorrow, good night and happy reading. You can all skedaddle.